We're going to take a few minutes to look at reading and writing across multiple texts at grade 9. This unit is Borderlands, Theories and Stories, and it is a personal favorite of mine. The texts are extremely interesting and engaging and challenging, and they raise questions that are so important to our world. This is Unit 4 in our curriculum. You'll see that it lines up with other reading and writing across multiple texts units. All of these units contain a number of different texts, different text types, and they engage students in producing different types of responses, as you'll see in a moment. The authors students will be reading in this unit are Marjane Satrapi, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Tony Cade Bambara. And we'll take a moment here to look at the structure of this unit before we open up the guidebook itself. So what you see on the screen here is the work that students will be doing with these three texts up at the top of the page. So students will begin by reading Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. They're not reading, if you're familiar with the text, the complete Persepolis. That book is divided into 2 volumes, so they're reading the first volume, The Story of a Childhood. They work to create a retelling of that text. They consider it through an interpretive lens, and they look at the arguments Satrapi is making in that work. And then they think about how they respond to those arguments. Are those arguments compelling to them? From there, we move into Anzaldúa's Towards a New Consciousness. And this text is at the heart of the unit because it provides the interpretive lens that we're going to use multiple times in the remaining work. Anzaldúa's text is dense and challenging and so rich. So this first work of crafting a retelling is really important in allowing students to process the text, put some of it in their own words, understand some of the key ideas with it. And then they move into some interpretive work so that they can unpack Anzaldúa's idea of a consciousness of the borderlands. What does she mean when she writes about this? It might seem like students take a different turn with the next text in the unit, which is The Lesson by Tony Cade Bambara. It might feel at first like they're doing some work from the Introduction to Argument unit, where we read a short story and we respond to an interpretive question with it. But that work is setting up some practice with Anzaldúa's ideas. So students read this story, interact with it, do some comprehension and interpretive work with this question, and then with that work as a foundation, they begin to look at this story by Tony Cade Bambara through the lens of the idea of the borderlands from Anzaldúa's text. So this is one of the major practices of these multiple texts units. There's a text that sets up a big idea, and we use that idea as a lens to look at other texts. So we practice with Bambara's story, using Anzaldúa's idea of the borderlands to see what it can show us about Bambara's story and what's going on in it. There's not a writing task associated with that work with the lesson. It sets us up to return to Persepolis. So now, having practiced using that idea, we look back at the story we began with and think about the idea of borderlands in Satrapi's story of Persepolis. Now, all of this work sets us up for one of our final tasks, which allows students to develop this idea of the borderlands that they've been working with and think about their own experiences. And so they write their own borderlands story. And just as Satrapi is reflecting on her own life and telling her own story, students have the opportunity here to reflect on the experiences of borderlands in their own lives and to write about it. And to be clear, we're not just talking about literal borderlands between spaces, which could be the topic, but Anzaldúa is writing about the borderlands of identity, the borderlands in all of the differences that we experience in our lives, these liminal spaces between things. And so these responses from students are often so rich and powerful. And we've heard wonderful feedback from teachers using this unit to engage with their students. As a final task, students revisit one of the text-based papers they wrote in this unit, and they revise it into a final draft. So keep that in mind, and as students are doing these writing tasks during the unit, you can keep a brisk pace, knowing that they will come back to one of those papers and choose to revise it for the final project. Then they'll write a brief reflection on what they've learned in the unit, and that draws the unit to a close. So, taking a closer look at the teacher manual of Borderlands, I want to begin, of course, with the introduction and some of the planning head notes, and then we'll take a look at the table of contents. I don't plan to talk through session by session every part of this unit because it is one of the longer units, and that would take more time than is necessary for this work. So my goal here is to hit a few of the highlights and talk you through a few of the different things that come up that you just want to be aware of in advance while you're planning. I always encourage everyone to read the introduction to our units. In this case, it talks through the structure of the unit a little bit like I've just been doing. You'll still want to take a look at that. I do want to point out a few things in the planning ahead section here. So before sessions 5 and 35, you will want to have collected student writing from the previous tasks and reviewed it at least enough to select a few examples or excerpts for the writing instruction that happens in those sessions. In two other places, sessions 7 and 8 and 30 and 31, you'll be using some samples of your own writing. So you'll take a crack at some of the text-based interpretive writing and use your own text as a little bit of a model with student work. And then you'll do the same thing when you're writing a Borderlands story. Those don't necessarily have to be complete pieces, but you'll want to use those first as a way for you to experience the kinds of work that students will be doing so that you can think ahead to the difficulties that they might run into along the way. And second, as a way to help apprentice students into that work. So once you've gone through it and thought through some of the challenges that you run into, you'll be well prepared to say, here's a model of the work that I was doing with it. Here are some of the challenges I ran into while thinking through this problem, and here were some of the ways I worked myself through those difficulties. And that's a way of talking students through the work they'll be doing and helping mentor them through that process. Going back to the table of contents, you'll see reflected here that structure I was talking through a moment ago, where students are working through Persepolis, then the Borderlands text, the lesson, back into Persepolis, and then writing their own Borderlands story. What I'll point out here is that the first 4 sessions of this unit are dedicated to reading through Persepolis. Because this is a graphic novel, it does not lend itself very well to read alouds in the way that we often do with other IBD texts. So you'll want to set aside time for students to read through that graphic novel. If your resources allow, they might even take it home to complete some of that reading. And in those sessions, they are completing a tracking chart of the text. So when you get to the end of a session, they might have been reading for a long time. They take a few minutes to chart major events, characters, things that have happened. You can give them a moment to catch up with each other about that, ask any questions, and prepare for the next day's work with that. Session 5 is where students need to have finished reading Persepolis because they begin working on a retelling of the text. And students get to exchange their retellings with one another and study the different ways that students summarize the text. And they think about what makes a good retelling, what did we choose to include or not include, and why. They then move into that interpretive work, looking at the arguments that Satrapi is making in her text. Some of those arguments are explicit, most of them are implicit. What does she seem to be saying below the surface of this text to us? So they work on interpreting that text, thinking about her arguments, what her agenda might be with that. And then they respond later on to how they feel about those arguments. Are they a sympathetic reader or not? Do they find those arguments compelling or not? I'll point out here that with this interpretive response here, students write this response and then move into whole class discussion about it, which you might notice is a reverse of some of the earlier structures in the year where they discuss and then write about. So in this case, they process independently, they think about it, they write about it, and they bring those ideas to a whole class discussion. From there, students move into Ansel Dua's piece from Borderlands. Now, I want to point out something in particular with this text. It is a fascinating text. It is a dense text. It has so much going on in it. There are parts of it that are in untranslated Spanish. There are parts of it that are written in verse. There are parts of it that read like memoir and like essay. It's an interesting blend of so many different styles and approaches. I really think it's valuable for students to read through this. And to have a read through where they get to go from beginning to end. Now, it might feel like they lose the thread a little bit along the way, but by the end of it, they'll be able to pick up enough of those ideas to come back to the text and start to think about it a little more clearly. So it's a challenging text, but it's worth working your way through and then coming back to for the retelling work and the interpretive work that follows. Now, there is another way of approaching this text. And I want to point out that right after the text from Anzaldúa, we also include a paraphrase of this text. That's not something we often do, but Anzaldúa's text is particularly challenging. Now, I have worked with many students with that text, and we have navigated it and its complexities together. But there is a paraphrase here for you to use if you need to in the classroom. And the ways you can use that are described in the teacher manual as you begin working with that text. So in session 13, you'll see that there's a teaching note. And it describes both the text itself and the paraphrase, and it says you can work through it this way, you have the option of working through it this way, or you can use both texts and begin with the paraphrase and use that to launch your work into Anzaldúa's text. You have options there for you. So don't just look at Anzaldúa's text and decide this is too hard, we're going to skip it entirely. Think about ways you might supplement that with a paraphrase if you need to. And honestly, I will say this too. You may decide that you don't need to use that paraphrase. It's not essential that students understand every single idea in Anzaldúa's challenging text. They are working with this concept of the borderlands, and that is relatively accessible overall. So her work is very challenging. The concept of the borderlands in it is relatively accessible. So you might find that you don't need to use the paraphrase at all. Students move through that. They get to work through the retelling tasks with that, and then consider her concept of the borderlands and the consciousness of the borderlands before moving into Bambara's text like we described earlier. Once again, you can keep in mind that students will choose one of their text-based writing tasks to revise at the end of this unit. So when they're writing in response to Anzaldúa or writing in response to Persepolis, either in part 1 or part 4, know that those don't necessarily have to be their final polished drafts. They can draft those papers, work on a few particular skills, and then come back to revise one of those for the final task. In the Borderlands story section, part 5, I just want to highlight that there are several sessions here for students to build their ideas, test out some of that planning work, draft them, do some of the cracking open work where working with a peer, they're looking for moments in a story that could be cracked open for more detail and sort of slowed down for the reader. So I like the cracking open work there. It's always good work for students who are working through a narrative. They have time to edit that and prepare a final draft and then study one another's stories. I really do mean it when I say powerful student writing comes out of these stories a lot of times, and you get that emotional impact from students telling their own stories. That can be hard to come by in schoolwork sometimes. You really have an opportunity for students to make a connection with this writing, with each other as a class, and you want to make sure that you're setting up a safe classroom environment where students feel they can share their stories with one another. Overall, that is a lot of writing going on in this unit. There's a lot of work for students to do, but it is very, very rich. And some of these writing tasks are really just 1 to 2 page responses that are meant to be written as a draft. So don't get overwhelmed by that as you go through it. And you can give students a heads up that they'll be dealing with some pretty challenging texts in this unit. They'll be doing a lot of writing, but try to keep it a fairly low pressure environment. Let them know that they'll get the chance to revise one of those, improve it. They'll be looking at their writing for opportunities to add to it during this unit. So that is Borderlands. Now, as you're planning, once again, you'll want to find the teacher manual and the student reader and flip through those. You'll want to read the unit introduction, the at a glance, review the major tasks in greater detail, and you'll especially want to read through each of the texts. I'll reiterate that. You want to be aware of what's coming ahead with this unit before it shows up in your classroom so that you know in advance any norms that you want to put in place and what to expect from students. It's a great unit. Like I said, it's one of my favorites. I hope you and your students enjoy it.